Welcome again to the Emerging Markets Entrepreneurs series here with my co-host Sid Y, Director of Forbes Africa, and today Colin Iles, the former Managing Director of Absa Bank and now an independent strategy consultant. Emerging entrepreneur is what we're talking about, and right now emerging entrepreneurs are like captains on a ship. You know, it's getting rough out there on the sea right now and windy, and slowly the ships are filling with water. And now the question is, you know, what should we as entrepreneurs, small business owners, marketeers, employees, what should we do? What should we focus on right now? Should we save the company and focus only on liquidity management, the topics that we've discussed before? Or, you know, what should we focus on long term? What are the things? What are the trade-offs? And this is why we have invited Colin here today to assist us and to assist in particular you, our listeners, and fellow entrepreneurs, to bring some light into this dilemma.
Thanks for having us on the show. Let me actually ask the first question to Colin. So what are sort of some of the structural changes organizations need to make in order to bounce back after 2 months of being in paralysis or forced hibernation?
Yeah, look, I think every organization is going to have to answer that in a different way, the structural change. I think it's better to say there needs to be a mind shift change. And what I mean by that is that, you know, whatever circumstances, whatever industry you're actually in, whatever your product or service is that you're doing, this pandemic and all of the pain and hurt that it brings is offering an opportunity for every organization to reinvent and reimagine its future. It's really giving a very good, I think, prediction of future events that are coming through, whether it be from technologies or other pandemics or other black swan type events. And I think that most organizations have got to use this. In fact, every organization has got to use this opportunity to rethink what the future is going to be like, how are consumers going to behave, what's going to happen if we go and have a hands-off economy for the next 3 or 4 years, what happens if there is no method to actually prevent this, it just becomes another flu or cold and we have it for the next sets of decades. So they've got to rethink the product, the services, the market fit, the opportunity that's out there, how behaviors are changing. Otherwise, they're going to miss the boat and the opportunities that, like I said, this terrible thing is bringing.
Alex, what are your views?
I 100% agree. I mean, what Colin is saying, or how I understand Colin, is we need to think about, you know, what assets do we have? What are our relationship to our clients worth? What resources do we have, and how can we differently allocate them in order to provide value in a newly forming economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me just even simplify it even further. Every organization, every business, right? It does one thing, and it solves a problem. That's the only purpose of business. You're there to solve some sort of problem. And so the world has now moved. It's been a big sort of tectonic shift, and many of the movements that we've seen, behavioral changes that previously would have taken decades, even generations for people to go through. This shift, because of the pandemic, is introducing and inculcating new behaviors that just technology alone couldn't have hoped to do so quickly. And so against that backdrop, what problems has it created? What problems has it solved, actually, and no longer are problems, and therefore those businesses are redundant? And I think every entrepreneur, every leader, every individual, you've got to rethink what this new set of problems are that have been created, because that is the purpose of business, to offer something productive which solves something which someone's willing to buy and compensate you for. And if you don't go through that thought process and hope it's going to come back to something like you're used to from years gone by, then you're out of business, I think.
So the question for me then is, how do companies have to change structurally in order to be able to respond to these external shocks better?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting one. And again, it depends on the structure that you have and what you're going to. But I'd say at the moment, what you're looking for, take some of the learnings from some of the better companies that are out there, where what is the difference between a good company and a bad company? And I think this is a moment in time when you can say there's a really obvious big difference. And the big difference is that good companies take good decisions more frequently than bad companies. All right? And what I mean by that, that is the only difference, actually, because when you think about it, whatever you produce, it's a set of decisions. And good companies somehow have managed to get that team around them where it's not just one senior person who's taking decisions on a quarterly basis, big decisions. They've got many decisions happening every single day on small things, whether it's new project features, to the big things. And they're frequent and they're good, and they're quite often built around some purpose, which is helping people to come and not have to be micromanaged in that decision making. So whatever your structure is, you've got to find a way where, if you're going to be adaptable now, so that you can go and change and pivot and reassess where you should be focusing your attention, this is a whole hope of new decisions that you're going to have to take. It's masses. And so you've got to go and find a way to structure yourself. And it's not just technically in terms of reporting lines on organograms and functions and that type of stuff. Emotionally structure yourself so that there's a wider set of opinions and ideas and decisions which you can take on the back of it, and hopefully some of them act quickly, rapidly, and take them from a very different risk paradigm. Otherwise, you're going to miss the boat. Things are moving too quickly to go and have standard orthodox decision-making trees that take months. And I suppose the way I look at it is, in a normal period, things can move quite slowly and you can survive. You can take months, even years. Now, this is highlighting that this is a pandemic, or it could be an exponential technology. You've got to be rapid. You've got to be adaptable. Otherwise, you're just not going to stay up with your competitors.
So it's about the agility and the adaptiveness, basically.
Correct.
So it's almost like what Charles Darwin said.
Very Darwinian. If you want to look at it in those terms, very Darwinian. We don't know what the future's like in 12 months. So if you're looking at it from a risk management and a decision-making basis, you cannot do stress testing and scenario analysis and competitor analysis, and examine Porter's 5 forces and all the standard textbook stuff. Right? It's just a complete waste of time. The only thing you can do
is that's from an independent strategy consultant now.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, it's just textbook garbage. The only thing you can do is look at this and you can say, these are the problems we think are there that are going to be there for a while, that we think we can solve. We think we've got the assets and intelligence, or we can adapt to it quite quickly. We want to hunt those down and try to go and solve those particular problems. And we think we can approach it in a way where we can run experiments to see if this is viable. We don't want to take, sort of big life-threatening 20-year decisions, but I think we can run sets of experiments to test our ideas and from those learn. And so we're moving into a world where you have to be running experiments to set your strategy, not setting strategies to go and decide to build things, and as many as you can. Experiments which you do what you do in the core, but let's try this. Let's see what happens to our consumers with this price change. What happens if it's this brand change? What happens if we're in the restaurant business and we start enclosing people in, perspex wigwams? We don't know. But companies have got to find ways to run these tests and experiments.
So, I mean, there's this historic discussion around strategy and structure. So now in the new world, do you think strategy follows structure or structure follows strategy?
Yeah, I think it's sort of strategy and culture, isn't it? The strategy eats culture for breakfast or vice versa. And I kind of look at it and go, it's slightly nuanced. I think purpose is the most important thing. It supersedes both of those things. What is the purpose that you're trying to achieve? Your business, not how are you going to make money and how do you go and get people to be more innovative and collaborative? What's your purpose? If you can get that set, okay, especially or reset or redefined in these current market conditions, it makes it so much easier, because by purpose, you're setting something which typically emotionally resonates. You're trying to do something which is typically good. You can clearly articulate the benefit that you're trying to bring to a sector of society, or even if it's a big thing, society as a whole. And if you get that straight, I think that it's much easier to go and get the other aspects coming in. So when you talk strategy, running experimentation, you can call that a strategy. Just because I'm not predicting ahead 3 years, I want an experimental mindset. I want people to learn by failure, not deliberately fail, but when they do, to learn from it. I want a community of people who are treating each other as equals. I want autonomy. I want a client base that gives me the freedom to try things, and they won't be too terrible on Twitter when I make mistakes, by being open and transparent with them. Those are all strategic statements in some ways, even though they're quite simple to make and not particularly textbook 3-year break it down, cost benefit and all the rest of it. But it starts with that purpose, I think, and now, particularly from a brand management perspective, organizations that are using purpose to drive their second stage of the models of who they hire and what they do, they've just got a massive advantage.
Mm. So do you think those traditional structures of companies, do you think they will still exist, or do you think they will phase out these, I have a marketing department, I have a customer service department, I have a operational department, whatever it is. I mean, if the world is changing super quickly, it's very difficult, I assume, to work in these silos, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for some companies, they've already phased out. Some companies that don't phase it out, it'll be a relevant question because they'll go bust. If you think about the cost and benefit, and there's always going to be this kind of accordion effect as we've got too many silos and too much functionality, and then we don't have enough, and you kind of, so it's always going to be there. It's going to be, repeating itself over time. But look at the downside of those structures: hierarchy, functionality, and silos. All right. Let's look at the upside. The upside is it's very robust. It's gives you procedures. It gives you certainty. If you want to maintain the status quo, which I'm not saying is a bad thing in all circumstances, it's perfect. All right. You have a mechanism where you can manage risk, take decisions. It's very easy to actually go and employ people into it. It's not very necessarily exciting if you are employed into it. And so you have a very kind of, if the world wasn't changing, a very sustainable business model. The trouble is that even before this pandemic, the world is changing quite quickly because of new technologies, different applications and different uses of artificial intelligence or robotics or 3D printing or 100 another one of the other technologies that are kind of coming to the fore at the moment and creating massive opportunities to disrupt markets. In a world like that, where things are changing just impossibly quickly compared to what we were used to just 10 or 15 years ago, rigid structures with silos, functionality, and hierarchies are definitely not the right model if you want to be adaptable and thrive. And so, at the very least, if you're an organization, you've got to keep those two things in context. The structured organization will be here, and we think it can plow a course through the pandemic or maybe with a few tweaks, but we need our radical organization here, which is a lot freer, a lot more like a startup. A lot more kind of almost on osmosis as people are learning off each other, and the hierarchies and the roles and the functions, they're less defined. And if you can get both in an organization, then I think you're in a good place. But very few seem to be able to do that, and particularly at scale. This kind of startup version usually gets quashed and killed.
I guess the important question there is at scale. From what you said, I guess one of the takeaways is that you could essentially see teams evolving into cross-functional, possibly decreasing in size, looking at responsibilities as opposed to procedures and silos, and sort of, does a perfect structure exist, and does size play a role in that structure?
So there's no such thing as a perfect role, because you can always improve it. So there's always the ability to make it better, but there's certainly the opportunity to set up very imperfect and inefficient structures. And in today's world, I can't think of an industry where the most standard management models are not placing themselves in a position where they are the worst decisions, to actually go and take us. So let's rephrase that. Every organization that has a standard hierarchy, functionalization, and silos is at risk of being disrupted because they become so rigid they cannot adapt quickly. And you can take a simple example. You imagine in that scenario, for just a reasonably sized company, you might have 20 people in a process. It could be whether you make widgets or sell consultancy services. It doesn't particularly matter. Maybe you make satellites. You will have the finance team doing something, the procurement team, the purchasing arrangement, the warehousing. You're going to have the compliance set function. You're going to have the IT team. You're going to have numerous teams. I haven't even mentioned marketing and sales, obviously, but none of them are part of the same team. And if you want to change anything that impacts anything on that process, you have to change all of those different 20 functions. And that's virtually impossible. The only person that ever has the power to really do that quickly is the CEO. Right? Even at a divisional level, because of centralization, you can't do stuff. So when you come across quite small things that can make a big difference for an area, it's very difficult to change it without changing and getting the buy-in from the whole of the people in that process snake or that process chain. And that is almost impossible to do. The only way that I've seen you can be effective is to bypass that and say, right, we're going to take a small team that represent the whole of that process and try to recreate it in a new way with a smaller set to try to build something which is different or unique or play with some new technologies. And that can be quite rapid and efficient, but not many companies, do that. So it's, the bigger you get, the harder it is to answer your question. And the base model that most have got already when they're even a medium-sized organization with just a few hundred people is already making it incredibly difficult for them to adapt and to thrive. And so at every level, if you're a startup, great, you're already in that place to adapt and thrive 10 or 15 people. As soon as you've got a couple of hundred, you've got to start trying to peel away groups of people who can keep you, whether it's being responsive in your core operations and just being better, or doing something, moonshot and radical. You cannot get away from the fact you've got to break them away from the structures that you've got in place.
For decent sized companies, I've heard now that, consulting firms go in there and they say now, okay, we recommend you have one team A that focuses on strategy and the long term, and the group B basically that is focusing on liquidity management and so on and so forth. Do you think, they're charging a lot of money to give this advice, but do you think this is really long-term the right advice that a consulting firm could give, or what would you answer if someone would give you that advice and you would still be the managing director of ABSA?
Look, there's lots of managing directors at ABSA, so not the managing director, but let's start with the benefits case. The benefits of having functionalization is that you get experts, right? So here's the liquidity code. Great. You are the liquidity team. What do you do? Well, we do liquidity. And what are you experts in? Liquidity. How long have you studied it for? Well, years. And how long have you practiced it for? Decades. So you get huge knowledge-based advantages when you go and set it up in a functional way. But the trouble is that you miss all the other stuff. So if you expand that model and you say, well, from a liquidity perspective, the best way we can improve it is we need to go and reduce debtor days. I need that cash, right? We want our suppliers, we're going to delay them on the creditor side. We're going to pay them in 6 months instead of 1 month. And on the customer side, we're going to go and start encouraging our salespeople to bring it in 1 month rather than a 3-month payment schedule. Huge advantage, much better funding model. We can save 50 million a year or 20, it doesn't matter what. Very obvious from a liquidity perspective. But now look at what you're missing. You haven't engaged with anyone outside of that. The customers are going to be really, really pissed, right? You haven't understood them. You've seen nothing from their perspective. Your suppliers are going to be pissed. You've seen nothing from their perspective. You've lost 2 key critical supporters. And so the business risk of taking decisions from a functional perspective, I think, is often missed. We can save money by doing X, but we don't see the optic of the emotional cost because we don't book that to our balance sheet, and therefore we haven't involved ourselves with other players. So when you've got the opportunity to bring in all of your functions together in a way where you get that cross pollination of ideas and ideally bring in people externally, you're going to come up with much better, much more rounded, I think much more sensible decisions, I think. So I don't agree that, with the consultants are saying you have to go and set that up in every context.
And if you now think about a lot of our listeners are really small businesses. So like, let's say between 5 and 30 or 40 or 50. There you don't really have silos because everyone is doing everything in any case.
Yeah.
What would you recommend a business owner like this in this scenario, this situation right now?
Well, in the sense of keep doing everything, I'd say keep doing everything in any place, right? Because what is it that the big businesses fail and are trying to copy? They're trying to copy the model of the small businesses and the startups. And your nimbleness as a startup is your advantage. Your ability to pivot and to change, and to have a close-knit set of people that work well together, to not have, if you think of all the advantages, if you've got a good culture and you're 10 to 40 people example, you don't have hierarchies, you don't have particularly decision-making trees. There's a lot of common sense that's applied. hopefully you've got a strong purpose, which makes it easier for people, so that you just wake up and you know that you're trying to go and achieve this kind of underlying goal, and you don't have to dictate and micromanage to people. So you've got huge advantages of just being small and a startup, as long as, I suppose, in this example, if you can be, let go of the past. It's kind of, you've reached a decision point. You've put the 10 years in to become an overnight success. But the future is going to be radically different. And I suppose emotionally, you've got to go and treat now every day as a new day. There's a new company out there. There's a new opportunity. And I suspect that's a little bit harder. It's harder than all times, because we always hold on to what we know. We hold on to what we've done. We hold on to where we've been successful. And we're in a very different landscape. So I was watching, it's a great video if I can find it, or you guys can find it. I was watching Simon Sinek. So, the king of why. One of the great kind of inspirers that's out there. I love watching him with the sort of why and the how and the three circles. And he's there with his team, and they're having to reinvent themselves. He's having the same conversation. Well, we've been incredibly successful, best-selling author, charging hundreds of thousands of dollars for him to present, doing a lot of advisory and keynotes. That model's dead. And he's got his team there on the Zoom conference call. He's just saying, what do we do next? And they're not sure. But at least they're saying we have to do something. We've got to drop this, no matter how much we loved it. We're dropping this, and we're going to go and start experimenting and trying, new things. And I think that was such a fantastic little presentation he did, to see himself trying to go and make that transition. It's hard.
Yeah, it is very hard. I mean, I can speak from experience right now. Also to share some stats. I mean, Stats SA or South Africa has published a report from the 14th of April to the 30th of April, and they surveyed 2,182 small businesses. 36% said they are laying off staff, 25% are decreasing working hours, and 9% by the end of April have already shut their doors. Yeah. So almost 10% of businesses in South Africa have shut their doors already. So the struggle is real. I can speak for myself. I mean, we've cut our costs by almost 60%. Our revenue dropped by 90%. It still doesn't add up.
Yeah.
Now, going into that, I mean, there are hard decisions to make. How do you communicate these? I know you've shared on LinkedIn also a great article from Airbnb on how the Airbnb founders have communicated to lay off thousands of people. And then I've seen also a video how Uber has laid off in a 3-minute Zoom call 3,500 people. What do you think, having had a huge team below you or with you, how do you think these things should be communicated?
Look, I think, that it's the obvious things, isn't it? You've got to treat them, I suppose, like family. How would you communicate in a serious event with your wife and your children, or your partner and your children? And so the best communication strategies that I've ever seen are the ones where you're 100% transparent, you're honest, and you're open about it. You explain the problems, the basis, for the decision. And, and then I think that you put yourself in a much better place. And I suppose, if I think about the way you do it, if you do it with integrity and faith and trust, and people can see that you've tried to do the best thing, and you've tried to do the best thing on behalf of all parties, then you're going to be in there's no easy way to sort of do it. I mean, let's be clear. But even before that, I think there's a question which is even better, and that's, what should you do before you enter actually having to go and reduce those costs, whether it's layoffs or furloughs or any other types of arrangements. And I think there's some great examples of organizations where they've really tried some quite unique approaches first. For example, rather than having to lay off 20% of the workforce, can we engage the workforce to collectively take a 20% reduction? Can we ask the workforce to go and collectively go to a 3-day week as opposed to a 5-day week? Obviously this is assuming that you think after the pandemic starts to lift, there's going to be a viable business in there on these types of decisions. Another company that I came across, they had a really interesting model, because when they were looking at the income disparity, they said, well, we're going to sort of leave it to you, but why don't we allow people to sort of buy and sell themselves into an equilibrium? So We want a 20% reduction. We're not going to tell people, but people that want to take 3 days a week off, that's great. They can reallocate whatever their earnings were to go and pay the people that either want or need to stay and do a 5 or a 6 day week. So there's loads of great, examples out there. Some of them are a little bit too extreme for most normal companies, like at least the larger ones. But in every case, it still seems to come back to being incredibly honest and open and transparent and communicative with the people, so that the understanding is there about the decisions that are being taken, and it's not an us versus you and I versus them type scenario.
Mm. Sid, is there anything that you think that is important in these type of communications, and what would you do, Sid, if there are hurdles within the team? Because I mean, people don't like to be laid off. However, you're going to communicate it. You're not going to be the nice guy.
No, you're never going to be the nice guy.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. But again, all you can do. I mean, let's look at. You mentioned one of the articles there, which I just thought was great. Now, not every company in hard times is going to be able to go and do this, but look upon it from your employee's perspective. Obviously, as an owner or a manager or a CEO, you're sitting there and you've got your own worries. Okay. From the employee's perspective, what are their worries? Okay, I'm not going to be able to get another job again. How am I going to be able to keep the family sort of going? Very different and more personal things perhaps compared to what you're thinking about from the overall company perspective, right? So what can you do to help them through that process? And I think this is exactly what, you're referring to on the article. Airbnb have said that we are going to go and offer counseling through the process. We're going to try to help with retraining, and we're going to go and try to help to find you, new jobs elsewhere. We're going to basically set up and work with recruitment agents in that process. So they've taken a very active role in trying to help people who they can no longer work with, aside from, a very well-written email to go and announce it, which must have taken someone a very long time to write in such a heartfelt manner. So, again, the more you can look at it from the affected person's perspective and walk in their shoes and try to go and help them in a way which goes above and beyond you just trying to ensure the survival of your company, the better off you're going to be. And the more likely, a later point, that honestly, they may want to come back if you get back up and running again. They may become your best advocates, to actually go and help you at some point in the future, rather than just becoming enemies and frustrated sort of, challenging types of relationships.
At least in the short run, they might be annoyed, but maybe not in the long run, you're saying.
Look, I don't know. I've been on the other side of it once or twice in both regards, and it's never easy.
Mm.
But I've always, would advise my own experiences, when it's honest, when it's open, it's transparent, when you do try to go and put a lot of consideration to the affected party to make their situation as best as you possibly can, you're in a much better situation. You might not walk away friends, but at least you should walk away with a level of respect for each other.
100%. Mm. Sid, how would you handle this, or what are your experience on this?
Well, I think one of the important things that we touched upon earlier was sort of culture, and it depends on the culture of the organization. If you have treated your employees and your colleagues like family, then it would only make sense to communicate bad news to them in a similar regard. Taking it a step further, we shouldn't just be discussing the finality of a termination, but also the change management process when you're implementing departmental changes. And I think not familiar with the article you quoted on Airbnb, but if there was a way that companies could help transition workers from one role to another within the organization, so not looking at jobs and titles and departments, but looking at skills, and then retraining them to do something else within the organization and preserving that job. I think that's a consultative process that companies can take on, particularly in times like this, where you're keeping good people around, just because it would be harder to find somebody to fill those shoes when things go back to normal.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, these are tough times. But do you think there is something like a right decision here right now? Because it seems like, for me, there's so many unknowns, or maybe even unknown unknowns, that we don't even know. Is there even something like a right decision in these times? Or at some point you have to say, as a business owner or manager, you just have to say, you know what? I'm innocent, but I'm guilty. I made the wrong decision, because I can either go left or right, but I don't know what's right.
Well, Colin touched upon this earlier in terms of experimentation. And one of the important elements of trying new things is occasionally failing. And as long as you fail often, but fail cheaply, and I mean that with keeping in mind that the repercussions of those failures are not massive to the sustainability of your organization, you should try new things and see what works. It's a constant state of reiteration.
So no sinking the ship errors, basically.
Don't sink the ship, but try to patch up the holes with, duct tape to begin with, and then try something else.
Colin, what do you think?
That's a good, lovely don't sink the ship, isn't it? I was chatting to Richard Browning, the founder of Gravity. He goes and flies those jet suits around, if you've never seen them, but check him out, gravity.co, I think it is. Anyway, an entrepreneur and inventor, and he's done some incredible things. But I like the way he phrases it. He says, look, never do an experiment that precludes you from doing a future experiment. In his terminology, he was really talking about not taking risks that could lead to his death as he's flying around on his kind of jetpacks. But the same in business. Never do an experiment which you think could preclude you from doing future experiments, either because the risk is too high, the cash expenditure is too high, the time until you see some sort of result is too long. You've always got to put yourself in a position where you can run the experiments and learn from them and keep going and build up, not having something which could potentially bring you down.
Yep.
All right. I think that's great advice for the fellow entrepreneurs out there. Thank you so much, Sid, for joining us, my co-host, and also Colin, thank you for this invaluable insight. I think every entrepreneur out there, do a lot of experiments right now, test your hypothesis, and get out of this pandemic stronger than you are before. I think that's what we can learn from this little chat we had here, and stay tuned. Next week, we are going to have another discussion about whether a company should pivot or whether a company should not pivot.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.